Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague, Sydney Derrick, our librarian. Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm your host, Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the Society. In this month's episode, we're exploring the story of two men who were accused of similar crimes but whose fates were very different. John Burnet, a Scottish immigrant, was taken into custody in the summer of 1775 in today's Colleton County. He was accused of preaching to enslaved people and encouraging them to preach on their own, as well as revolt against their enslavers. Another man accused of preaching at those same gatherings was an enslaved man named George, and while John eventually went free, George met a very different end. We've talked about John Burnet a bit in a past episode about the Council of Safety Journal, the government of our state that was established just before the American Revolution began. In that episode, we discussed what he was accused of and the consequences of his actions. Today, though, we're going to compare his fate to that of George. But before we get too far into their story, let's hear some announcements. Our stories around the state continue with speaking events in Walterboro, Chesterfield, and Cheraw over the next couple of months on a variety of topics related to the American Revolution. Check out the Programs and Events tab on our website, schistory.org, to get dates and exact locations. And the official 250th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Moultrie, also known as Carolina Day, is coming up soon, along with the Declaration of Independence, of course, and we're doing it up big at the Fireproof Building. Stay tuned to our social media and website for announcements of events, but one that I can tell you about right now is in partnership with the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. They are bringing their traveling exhibition, Foundations of a Revolution, to our museum on June 27th. It features several founding documents, including the South Carolina Constitution of 1776. Of course, you can always get information about upcoming events at the Programs and Events tab on our website, schistory.org. For this episode, the sources we used are the Henry Lawrence papers, housed in the South Carolina Historical Society archives. A book, The Hanging of Thomas Jeremiah, A Free Black Man's Encounter with Liberty by J. William Harris. Side note, this is a great book that discusses the hanging of a free black man who piloted boats in the Charleston Harbor on the suspicion that he was aiding the British. Now, this happened around the same time as the story of John Burnet and George, and along with other happenings at the time, give context for the level of fear that enslavers had of enslaved people, or black people in general, rising up to fight with the British. Other sources include an article, Henry Lawrence, Christian Pietist, by Samuel C. Smith, published in the South Carolina Historical Magazine, Volume 100, Number 2. A book, The Enslaved and Their Enslavers, Power, Resistance, and Culture in South Carolina, 1670 to 1825, by Edward Pearson. A web article, Preventing Slave Insurrection in South Carolina and Georgia, 1775 to 1776, by Jim Pikage, accessed on the website for the Journal of the American Revolution. Volumes 11, 13, and 14 of The Papers of Henry Lawrence, edited by David R. Chestnut et al. And an article, Domestic Enemies, Slavery and Political Independence in South Carolina, May 1775 to March 1776, by Robert A. Alwell, published in the Journal of Southern History, Volume 55, Number 1. On July 5, 1775, a man named Thomas Hutchinson sent a letter to the Council of Safety in Charleston, a government less than a month old at the time. This letter is now housed in the Henry Lawrence collection here at the Society. Thomas was a justice of the peace for St. Bartholomew's Parish and lived in an area near the Cheehaw River in today's Colleton County, about 40 miles away from Charleston. Thomas and others served on the parochial committee for the parish, and they were kind of a local court system. In his letter, he reported a man named John Burnet, a Scottish immigrant, had been gathering enslaved people for meetings at night, which John claimed was for religious services. Thomas, though, said that John had, quote, been often told his conduct was extremely obnoxious to the people, as they were apprehensive it might be attended with mischievous consequences. However, he persisted and continued incorrigible, for which the parochial committee have thought it expedient for the peace and quiet of the parish to ship him for Charlestown, and if you are of the opinion with them that he may be as hurtful there, presume he will be made to travel still further, end quote. In other words, because of these meetings with enslaved people, the committee decided to get him out of their parish and to Charleston, where the Council of Safety could decide what to do with him. Thomas presents as evidence against John Burnet the testimony of an enslaved man named Jemmy, whose enslaver was John Wells. Jemmy told the parochial committee that many enslaved people had been preaching at these nighttime gatherings with John Burnet, including a man named George, a woman named Daphne, and a man named Jupiter, all enslaved by different plantation owners. Jimmy confessed that he had also attended these meetings. According to his testimony, the meetings often happened in the woods, sometimes on the plantation of Mr. Austin, who was away. Thomas writes in his letter that Jimmy also reported that one enslaved preacher in particular, George, spoke out about a book given to King George II by God, which told him to set the enslaved people free, but because he had not, he was now dead, and the new king, George III, was going to follow its instructions soon and set all of them free. George was enslaved by a man named Francis Smith, who was a planter in St. Bartholomew's Parish. Many of the plantations there grew rice as their main source of income. Francis did have land that sat on a branch of the Combahee River called Wannell's Creek at the time, today known as Cuckold's Creek. We don't know if that was where George was enslaved or what role he had on Francis's plantation, but there's a good chance it involved rice production, and that was labor-intensive work. Before writing to the Council of Safety about John Burnet, the parochial committee in St. Bartholomew's Parish had already ruled on the cases of the enslaved people involved. In his letter, Thomas indicates that they decided to punish George by hanging him. But before his execution, Thomas writes that George claimed that it was John Burnet, the white man from Scotland, who told them about the book given to the king in the first place, and that it was John who had told them they were, quote, equally entitled to the good things of this life in common with the whites, end quote. Burnet was already not a popular man amongst the planters of the area. Thomas Hutchinson notes in his letter that he was someone who, quote, the neighborhood in general have long since wished had never come to this province, end quote. And a quick side note about that line about how they wished he had never come to this province originally read that they wished Burnet, quote, remained in Scotland where he was born. But before the letter was presented to the Council of Safety, another member of the St. Bartholomew's parochial committee wrote to Henry Lawrence and asked him to change the wording before it was presented, quote, to avoid all appearances of national reflection, end quote. In other words, they didn't want to seem like they were prejudiced towards Scottish people. Because John Burnet was a white man being accused by an enslaved black man, the committee in St. Bartholomew's Parish couldn't punish him on that basis alone. So that's when they kicked it up to the Council of Safety to decide John's fate. He was taken to Charleston and put in the military barracks there under guard until his case could be heard. We don't have a record of John's testimony before the council, but 13 days after he was sent to Charleston, Henry Lawrence responds to the committee in St. Bartholomew's Parish. Henry was president of the Council of Safety at the time and explained that John's side of the story was really the only thing they could use to judge him. And in that version, according to Lawrence, John confessed to praying with enslaved people in the past, but said he had abandoned the practice when he was first admonished in 1773 2 years before Hutchinson's letter to the council. John also told the council he knew nothing of the book that George spoke of, and that, quote, he had never anything more in view than the salvation of those poor, ignorant creatures, end quote. Laurens also wrote that John told them he never encouraged insurrection, that his purpose in teaching them the gospel was to help, quote, reconcile them to that lot in life in which God had placed them, and to impress upon their minds the duty of obedience to their masters, end quote. Because of this, there wasn't much more the council could do, according to Laurens. They basically admonished him and made him promise to never do it again. Henry reported to the St. Bartholomew Parochial Committee that John Burnet was then dismissed and had received a job offer in Georgia so that he would no longer be a problem for the planters of the parish. What Laurens didn't mention is that the job offer came from himself. In August of 1776, about a year after John Burnet stood before the Council of Safety, Laurens wrote a letter to Lachlan McIntosh, who was also from the Chehaw River area of St. Bartholomew's Parish, and thanks Lachlan for sending him a letter by Mr. Burnet. Laurens owned 2 plantations in Georgia, Broughton Island and New Hope, and in a document that shows a request for reimbursement from the state of Georgia by Laurens, one line asked for a reimbursement for public work that John Burnet did in May of 1776. In a June 1777 letter written by Henry Laurens, he mentions that a house on one of his plantations is to be put into good order by John Burnet for the new overseer, and that he left a case of rum that he wanted Burnet to deliver. Later that month, Laurens writes a letter about readying his plantations in Charleston for the hurricane season that began in August. He writes, quote, I caution you because you have never seen a hurricane. You should have bars of strong wood ready to fasten in all of your windows. Keep every article liable to damage 6 inches off of your floor, and nothing so low as the common surface of the earth in the cellars. These you must expect to brim full, your house and outhouses overflowed, your fences blown down. Save all those cypress boards near the counting house and in the yard for repairing fences, and in case of disaster, send immediately for Burnet and Sam, who will probably be at Mebkin. Now, Mebkin was the name of a plantation where Henry Laurens spent most of his time, and it was located just outside of Charleston. Today, that location is Mebkin Abbey, so you may have heard of that. In June of 1778, a year later, Henry Laurens writes a letter to John Rutledge, who served with him on the Council of Safety. At this point, the war is raging, and the area of St. Augustine and East Florida is under British control. Now, this is very close to the border of Georgia and Florida. In the letter, Laurens writes to Rutledge that he is, quote, thinking very seriously of an enterprise against the place where you and I, sir, once sent John Burnet. We may, if the British troops should withdraw and not pay Charlestown too serious a visit, obtain proper officers and men for beginning the operation the 1st November, the most proper month in the 12, end quote. And essentially, Laurens was telling Rutledge that he may lead a mission with troops behind him to the border of Georgia and Florida, or perhaps even an attempt to take St. Augustine and East Florida from the British. But the important part is that he references that it's where they sent John Burnet. The next month, July of 1778, Burnet is still employed by Henry Laurens, but he's now definitely back in South Carolina. We know this because Laurens, who at the time is in Philadelphia serving in Congress, writes him a letter saying, quote, I received much satisfaction by learning from Mr. Zahn that you continued at Mount Tacitus. I hope I shall find you there or in some other of my plantations where you shall think you may be most serviceable, end quote. Mount Tacitus was a plantation that Henry owned on the banks of the Santee River, which is north of Charleston. Henry goes on to instruct Burnet about procuring wood to build a log house on the plantation, like those he saw and lived in while in Yorktown. The rest of the letter talks of the battles ongoing at the time, Laurens's perceived cruelties of the English and the Native Americans who fight with them, and how the tide may be turning against the British because of the increased number of deserters coming to the American side. Laurens ends the letter, quote, with respect to your wages, whatever Mr. Zahn does will meet with my approbation, end quote. There is one more mention of Burnet in a letter later that year, but that's the last we hear of him from Henry Lawrence. We don't know why Henry and the Council of Safety allowed John Burnet to go free without punishment beyond what they claimed in their letter, which was that all they had was his story to go on, and he said it didn't happen that way. We also don't know what their opinion on George's fate would have been, since it was decided before they heard the story. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, the leaders of South Carolina were very concerned about enslaved people rising up against them and siding with the British, because just numbers-wise, that could be overwhelming for the Americans. It doesn't seem like John Burnet had any other later incidents in his time working for Henry where he was accused of something similar. As I mentioned before, there was another man, Thomas Jeremiah, who was a free black harbor pilot who was also hanged because those in power thought that he was working with the British to help them with an invasion, and Henry Lawrence was very much in favor of Jeremiah's hanging. And this was the same summer when the last royal governor, Lord William Campbell, came into power, who was very much against the hanging of Thomas Jeremiah and spoke out publicly about that, which created a bit of conflict between him and the Americans, conflict that increased the ongoing conflict. This same summer was when Sullivan's Island saw an influx of escaped enslaved people traveling there at the encouragement of the British, according to the Americans in power. Lord Dunmore of Virginia, his proclamation encouraging enslaved people to come over to the British side with them and be freed would come later in the fall that year, but that sense was already in the air, that if enslaved people could get to the British or could get away from their enslavers, then they could be free. That was something that the enslavers were worried about and increased those tensions that were already rising because of the desire for American independence from Great Britain. And later that summer, the Council of Safety, which Henry Lawrence again was president of, actually ordered troops to Sullivan's Island to clear out those escaped enslaved people in order to assert their authority and also make way, eventually, for what would become Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island that would defeat the British the next year in a naval battle. So that gives you a little bit of context for what was going on at the time, but the contrasting fates of John and George do show that the benefit of the doubt that was given to white men, even those with no property of their own, like John, was withheld from those who were enslaved. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. We'll see you back here on the second Monday in May. We'll actually have 2 episodes for you next month, all about DuBose Hayward and his wife Dorothy. We'll be speaking with author Harlan Green, who wrote the book Porgy's Ghost about Dorothy Hayward, who was DuBose's wife. And we'll also be talking with Annette Guild, who is our digitization specialist here at the Society. She has been working on digitizing some of the Hayward papers to get those online for researchers. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'd love if you could leave us a rating or a review on whatever podcast app you're listening on so that more people can find our show. We'll see you soon.